March 14, 1950. The floor of the United States Senate. A Democrat from Colorado named Edwin C. Johnson rose to speak, and what he said about a 34-year-old Swedish actress went into the congressional record and stayed there for 22 years. He called her one of the most powerful women on earth and said that he regretted to report she was a powerful influence for evil. He described her and Rita Hayworth as apostles of degradation. He said she had perpetrated an assault upon the institution of marriage, and he introduced a bill that would have required actors, producers, and filmmakers to hold federal licenses that could be revoked for scandalous personal conduct. America decided that was the moment Hollywood threw Ingrid Bergman out. Denounced in the Senate, condemned from pulpits, banned from the screen, driven into a 7-year European exile for having a child with a man she was not married to. That is the story, and the central fact in it is not true. She was never banned. There was no list, no policy, no letter, no vote, no document of any kind excluding Ingrid Bergman from American film. That absence is the whole story. That is what makes it secret, and that is why it worked. Because her father was a photographer who filmed his daughter obsessively from the time she could walk, and she picked up the habit and never put it down. Because the entire affair began with a letter she wrote herself, an unsolicited job application in 4 languages to a director she had never met. Because the studio boss who supposedly punished her by shelving her film actually recut it and rushed it into cinemas to cash in on the scandal, and it flopped anyway. Because the man denouncing her in the Senate had, until that year, considered her his favorite actress. Because she did not see her eldest daughter for years. And because everything we now know about the inside of this, the diaries, the letters, the home movies, the record that historians actually use, exists for one reason. She kept it, every scrap of it. And it sits today in a university archive in Connecticut, complete. It started with a letter in the spring of 1948. But before the letter, there was a camera shop in Stockholm. Ingrid Bergman was born there in August 1915 to Justus Bergman, a Swedish photographer and painter who ran the shop, and Friedel Adler, who was German. Her mother died when Ingrid was not yet 3. Her father raised her alone, and here is the detail that matters more than any other in her childhood. He filmed her. He had the equipment and he had the inclination, and he pointed both at his daughter constantly. There is surviving footage of Ingrid Bergman as a very small child, moving around a Stockholm apartment, being directed by her father from behind a camera. She was, in the most literal possible sense, a photographed object before she was old enough to consent to it, and it was the person who loved her most who was doing it. Hold on to that camera. It comes back at the end of this story, and when it does, it is in her hands. Then Justus died. She was 12. She went to live with an aunt, and the aunt died within months of a heart condition. She ended up with an uncle and his wife and their children, in a household that was kind enough but was not hers. By 13, she had lost her mother, her father, and the woman who had replaced them. Now look at what she did next, because it explains everything that happened in 1949, and almost nobody connects it. She began acting. She got into the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, the most rigorous training available in the country, and she worked. And she began, this is documented from her own surviving papers, keeping things, letters, photographs, programs, diaries. She started building a paper record of her own existence in her teens, and she never stopped for the next 50 years. That is not a hobby. A child who loses 3 parents by 13 and then constructs a permanent physical archive of herself is doing something specific. She is making sure there is proof. She made Swedish films, and in 1936 she made one called Intermezzo, and a print of it reached David O. Selznick in Hollywood. In 1937 she married Petter Lindstrom, a dentist who would later retrain as a neurosurgeon. Their daughter Pia was born in 1938, and in 1939, Selznick brought her to America to remake Intermezzo in English. And this is where the trap that would spring in 1949 was built deliberately by people who thought they were doing her a favor. Selznick's instinct, and it was a good one commercially, was that she should not be processed. The standard treatment for an imported actress in 1939 was total. New name, plucked eyebrows, capped teeth, heavy makeup, a manufactured biography. Selznick looked at her and decided to do almost none of it. He kept the name Ingrid Bergman, which was regarded internally as a risk because Americans would struggle with it. He kept her eyebrows. He put her in front of a camera with far less makeup than any comparable star of the period wore, and the publicity campaign sold precisely that. She was marketed as the real one, the natural one, the actress who had not been assembled. In a town where every single face was a construction, the selling proposition for Ingrid Bergman was that hers wasn't. Now, understand what that means as a business asset, because this is the mechanism of everything that follows. Lana Turner's image could survive a scandal because Lana Turner's image was openly a manufacture, and nobody had promised otherwise. Ingrid Bergman's image could not survive one, because the entire product was the claim that there was no gap between the woman and the picture. Sell authenticity, and you have sold something that a single fact can destroy. That's not a moral vulnerability. That's a structural one, and it was built into her contract from the first day. Meanwhile, there was the marriage, and I want to be fair to Petter Lindstrom because he is usually flattened into a villain, and he was not one. He was an intelligent, demanding, controlling man who managed her career with genuine competence. He handled the contracts, the money, the negotiations with Selznick. He was, by many accounts, better at it than most agents in town. He was also, by her own later account, and by the accounts of people around them, cold, and he made her account for herself. So consider her position through the 1940s. She had a husband who ran her professional life and a studio that ran her image. And she had arrived at both arrangements at 24, having spent her adolescence in houses that belonged to other people. There is a pattern here that she never broke until she broke it catastrophically. The films came fast, and they were enormous. Casablanca in 1942, For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943, and a first Oscar nomination, Gaslight in 1944, and the Oscar, Spellbound and Notorious for Hitchcock. She was, by the middle of the decade, one of the 2 or 3 biggest stars in the world, and by the polling that studios ran, close to the most admired. And then Hollywood did the thing that sealed it. In 1945, she played a nun, the Bells of St. Mary's opposite Bing Crosby, Sister Benedict, a performance that got her another nomination and was one of the highest-grossing pictures of the year. And in 1948, she played Joan of Arc, a saint, in armor, on a horse, in a prestige production she had pushed hard to make. Count what that means. Inside 3 years, the woman marketed as the only unfabricated face in American cinema had portrayed a nun and a canonized saint, and the audience had been invited to understand these as expressions of who she actually was, because that was the whole premise of the marketing. The industry had spent a decade building the most rigid possible container and putting a restless 33-year-old woman inside it. Nobody involved thought of it as a risk. It was the most profitable image in the business. And she was restless, and she said so at the time. And nobody listened because there was no commercial reason to. She had fought to make Joan of Arc, and the film had underperformed badly. She had been in America for 9 years playing variations on decency. She drank, she smoked, she had already had affairs, with the photographer Robert Capa, among others. And none of it had ever reached print, because the studio system existed to make sure it didn't. That is the part worth holding on to before we get to Italy. The gap between the woman and the picture had been there the whole time. It was not created in 1949. It was merely, in 1949, no longer possible to conceal. Now, the letter, and it is the single most important document in this story. She saw Roberto Rossellini's Rome, Open City, and then Paisan, and they did to her what neorealism did to a lot of people in 1948. Understand what those films were, because the word neorealism has gone soft with use, and at the time, it was a genuine rupture. Rome, Open City was shot in 1945 in a city that had been occupied a few months earlier, on scraps of film stock bought where it could be found, in real streets, with a cast that mixed professionals and people who simply lived there. It is about the resistance, and it contains a sequence, a woman running after a truck, that people who saw it in 1945 described as unlike anything cinema had done before. Paisan followed in 1946, 6 episodes moving up the peninsula with the Allied advance, largely with non-actors. These were films with no sets, no lighting plan, no stars, and no score to tell you what to feel, made by a man who often shot without a finished script and rewrote in the morning based on what he found. And they made the studio product Ingrid Bergman had been making for 9 years look like furniture. That is not my judgment. It is roughly what she said herself. So in May 1948, Ingrid Bergman, Academy Award winner, one of the most bankable performers alive, sat down and wrote to a director she had never met in Italy, cold. And the letter is famous because of how it is constructed. She introduced herself as a Swedish actress who spoke English very well, who had not forgotten her German, who was not very understandable in French, and who in Italian knew only 2 words, ti amo. If he needed such a person, she wrote, she was ready to come and make a film with him. Read that for what it actually is. It is a job application. It is written in the register of an unemployed actress touting for work, by a woman who at that moment could have named her price at any studio on earth. It is also, in its last clause, a joke that is not entirely a joke, and every person who has ever read it has noticed that. She wrote it herself. Nobody drafted it, nobody approved it, no agent placed it. It is, as far as the record goes, the first professional act of her adult life that did not pass through her husband or her studio. And she kept a copy. Hold on to that too, because in about 40 minutes it becomes the reason this story can be told at all. She went to Italy in early 1949 to make Stromboli, financed by RKO, which was owned by Howard Hughes. And the affair began during the shoot, on an island, with a crew of locals and a director who worked without a finished script. What did each of them see? Both columns, because the version where a great artist seduced a naive star is Italian mythology, and the version where she threw away everything for love is American mythology, and neither is sufficient. She saw a way out of a container, not just the marriage, the whole apparatus. A director who did not want her to be beautiful, who did not want her to hit marks, who wanted her uncomfortable and improvising in real places. For a woman who had spent 9 years being lit and managed, that was not a romance. It was liberation with a man attached. He saw an international star and a budget, and it is worth being blunt about him, because the hagiography around Rossellini has been thicker than the one around her. He was 42, married, and had been for years in a relationship with the actress Anna Magnani, who had been the woman running after the truck in Rome, Open City, and who did not take the arrival of Ingrid Bergman quietly. He was a famous seducer, and nobody around him pretended otherwise. He was also permanently and structurally broke. A man who made films on money he did not have, in an industry with no capital, in a country that had been bombed flat 4 years earlier. Bergman's name solved that. Her participation is what brought American money to Italian neorealism. It is what made an RKO check possible, and worldwide distribution, and a budget of a size he had never worked with. He got the most famous woman in the world into his film, and eventually into his house. And it rescued his finances for the better part of a decade. Both things ran at once, and both of them meant it, and it does not have to be one or the other. Then the news broke. Luella Parsons, working her sources, published in 1949 that Ingrid Bergman was pregnant by Roberto Rossellini. Robertino was born on February 2, 1950. The Mexican divorce and the proxy marriage followed later that year. Now here is where I want to slow the whole thing down, because what happened next is told wrong in essentially every account, and the true version is more disturbing than the myth. There is one written warning in this entire affair, and it came before anything was public. Joseph Breen, who ran the Production Code Administration, the industry's own censorship office, wrote to her privately in 1949 when the rumors were circulating and told her plainly what would happen, that she would be destroyed, that the American public would not forgive it, that her career would not survive. That letter is the only document the industry produced. Think about that for a second and then hold it, because I am going to come back to it, and when I do, it will be the hinge of this entire story. Because after Breen's warning, the American film industry did nothing written, no formal action of any kind. Here is what did not happen. There was no ban. No studio issued a statement refusing to employ her. The Motion Picture Association passed no resolution. The Production Code did not prohibit her appearance in films. It governed content, not casting. Senator Johnson's licensing bill, the one that would have created an actual legal mechanism, was introduced and went nowhere and never became law. There's no blacklist with her name on it, because unlike the political blacklist running at exactly the same time, this one was never written down. So what actually happened to Ingrid Bergman between 1950 and 1956? Nobody offered her a job. That is the entire mechanism. Producers did not call. Studios did not bid. Scripts did not arrive. And because no one had ever said anything, there was no decision to appeal, no policy to challenge, no person to lobby, and no document to point at. She could not be reinstated because she had never been suspended. That is why this was secret. Not because anybody whispered. The denunciations were as loud as they get on the floor of the Senate. It was secret because the actual exclusion was invisible. The noise was public and the machinery was silent. And the machinery was just a large number of individual men, each independently deciding not to make a phone call. That's not a ban. That's an industry declining, in unison, to be the first one to go back. And here is the thing that ought to be said about the public, since the public is what the whole exclusion was supposedly protecting. The mail she received in those months was, by the account of the journalist Art Buchwald, who read it, substantially violent and threatening. That was real, and there was a great deal of it, and nobody should soften it. But it was not the only mail. A group of members of Congress wrote to let her know that in the middle of the turmoil, she still had admirers. James Agee, the critic and screenwriter, one of the most respected film writers in America, publicly counted himself among the many people who had thorough sympathy for her. So the picture is not a country united in disgust. The picture is a country arguing with itself loudly in both directions, which is what countries do. The industry looked at that and chose to hear only one side of it, and to treat the loudest correspondence as a market signal. Now why? And this is where I want to be precise, because the moral panic is real, but it is not the explanation, and treating it as the explanation lets the industry off. Consider what else was happening to Hollywood between 1948 and 1950. In 1948, the Supreme Court's Paramount decision forced the studios to divest their theater chains and began dismantling the vertically integrated system that had made them rich. Television was arriving and box office had started falling. And since 1947, the industry had been under sustained public attack for harboring communists and had responded with the Waldorf Statement and a blacklist, precisely to demonstrate that it could police itself and did not require Washington to do it. That is the crucial context. In 1950, Hollywood's central political argument was, "We handle our own," Leave us alone. We do not need federal licensing. We do not need a censor in Washington because our own house is in order." And then a United States senator stood up and proposed exactly the thing the industry feared most: federal licensing of performers and producers, using Ingrid Bergman as the reason. She was not excluded because a few thousand church groups sent letters. She was excluded because in the spring of 1950, the American film industry was fighting for its legal life, and the cheapest possible way to prove that it policed morality without federal help was to let one woman's career die quietly and be seen not to intervene. That's not a moral verdict. That's a lobbying position with a person underneath it. And that reading is confirmed by the one man who behaved differently and behaved worse. Stromboli was released by RKO in February 1950, and it bombed. And Senator Johnson said on the floor of the Senate that the stupid film about a pregnant woman and a volcano had exploited America to the mutual delight of RKO and Rossellini. Note the detail buried in that sentence because the senator noticed it even if history hasn't. Howard Hughes owned RKO. Hughes had the film, and what he did with it was cut it, reducing Rossellini's version substantially and against the director's wishes, and rush it into theaters to capitalize on the scandal with advertising that pointed at exactly the thing everyone was pretending to be appalled by. The studio head with the most direct financial exposure to Ingrid Bergman did not shun her. He monetized her. He recut her film to sell the disgrace, and it failed anyway, and he moved on. If this is landing for you, subscribe, because the last third is where the exile ends, and the way it ends tells you the whole moral panic was a fiction the industry maintained about its own audience. But first, the part that is genuinely unbearable, and it has nothing to do with the industry at all. Petter Lindstrom did not give her a divorce easily, and the fight over their daughter ran for years across two legal systems and was, by any measure, the ugliest thing in this story. Look at the position she had put herself in. She had gone to Italy in early 1949 for what was contractually a film, and she did not come back. Pia was 10 years old and in California with her father, who held the marital home, the money, and the enormous procedural advantage of being the parent who was physically present in the jurisdiction. Bergman was in Italy, pregnant by another man, in a relationship that half the American press was describing as a national scandal. What followed was litigation on two continents. There was a Mexican divorce and a proxy marriage, which Lindstrom's side disputed. There were competing proceedings in California, and the practical outcome, whatever the paperwork said in any given month, was that Ingrid Bergman was substantially separated from her eldest daughter through most of the girl's teenage years, and for a long stretch did not see her at all. I am not going to pretend the legal record settles the blame, because it does not. Lindstrom was a wronged husband acting within his rights, and he was also a controlling man using a child as an instrument, and both of those can be true at once. Pia herself has spoken about those years as an adult, and her account is neither a prosecution nor an absolution. But now put the whole thing beside a Stockholm apartment in 1918. A 3-year-old loses her mother. At 12, she loses her father. At 13, she loses the aunt who took her in. The single organizing fact of Ingrid Bergman's childhood is that the people who are supposed to be there stop being there, and it happens repeatedly, and no one is at fault, and there is nothing to be done about it. And then, at 34, she made a choice. And the consequence of that choice was that a girl grew up without her. I am not going to convert that into a tidy verdict. She chose, and there were 3 other children in Italy who did have her. And Pia Lindstrom grew up, became a working television journalist in New York, and eventually reconciled with her mother and has spoken about her since with a clear and unsentimental warmth. The reconciliation is real, and it took years. But the shape of it is what it is. The woman whose entire life was organized around the disappearance of parents became, for a period, a disappeared parent. That is not hypocrisy. and it is not karma. It's the same wound arriving from the other direction, and it is the precise reason for everything she kept. Look again at what is in that archive. Photographs of all 4 children, locks of hair, valentines, school papers, her baby pictures, a note pinned to a dress in her own handwriting saying, "First wedding dress." The film scholar Janine Basinger, who acquired Bergman's archive, described her as a professional international wanderer whose baggage was not jewelry and furs, but the emotional baggage of memory, and wrote that her true home was never geographical, it was archival, and that she held things close because she could not always hold people close. That is the single best sentence anyone has written about her, and it is the answer to why this script can exist. Now, the exile itself, and here is what nobody tells you about it. She was not idle for 6 years. She was working the entire time, and the work was extraordinary, and almost nobody went to see it. She and Rossellini made a run of films together in those years. Europa 51 in 1952, in which she plays a wealthy woman whose son dies and who responds by walking out of her class entirely. Viaggio in Italia in 1954, which is essentially a marriage disintegrating over a few days in Naples, with almost no plot and 2 people driving around looking at ruins. Others followed. They were, commercially, close to catastrophic. They did poor business in Italy, worse in America, and the reviews at the time ranged from baffled to hostile. Critics who had loved her in Gaslight watched her stand in an Italian street doing apparently nothing and concluded that Rossellini had wrecked her. And then the assessment inverted completely. Within a decade, the young French critics who were about to become the new wave had decided that Viaggio in Italia was one of the most important films ever made, that it had invented a way of shooting the interior life of a marriage that nothing before it had managed. Directors have been citing it ever since. It now appears on the kind of lists that Casablanca appears on. Sit with that arithmetic for a second. The 6 years in which Ingrid Bergman was described as having thrown her career away produced work that is now, by critical consensus, more significant than most of what she made at the height of her fame in Hollywood. The exile was not a gap in her filmography. It is arguably the best part of it. It simply took 20 years for anyone to say so, and by then the story of the ruined woman had hardened into fact. Now the return, and this is the part that demolishes the official version. In 1955, 20th Century Fox had a property called Anastasia, and Daryl Zanuck decided to cast her in it. That decision is the entire ending of this story, so be clear about what it involved. Zanuck was not making a moral gesture. He was a producer with a European production, a strong script, and an actress available at a fraction of what she would have cost in 1948, whose name still meant something everywhere outside the United States. He was taking a commercial risk that 6 years of other men had declined to take, and he was taking it at arm's length in London and Paris, where the American press could be managed. And there was still resistance to it. Some Catholic organizations objected to the casting when it was announced, and there were scattered calls for the picture to be avoided. Zanuck went ahead anyway, and that is the whole of the courage involved. One executive calculating that the objectors were fewer and quieter than everyone had assumed, and being right. The film came out in 1956. American audiences went. It made money. And in March 1957, Ingrid Bergman won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She was not there. Cary Grant accepted on her behalf and addressed her directly from the stage, telling her that if she could hear him, her friends in the room were sending their love and congratulations. 6 years and 11 months after the Senate floor, the same Academy, the same town, the same voters. And then the detail that should end the moral panic argument permanently. When Ed Sullivan wanted to have her on his program in 1957, he taped an interview and then, rather than simply airing it, asked his television audience to write in and tell him whether he should. Think about what that reveals. Sullivan was not a moralist. He was a broadcaster with sponsors, and he did not know what the audience thought because nobody had ever asked them. 7 years of industry certainty about what America would not tolerate, and the first person to actually check had to run a poll. For 7 years, an entire industry had described a public appetite for punishment that it had never once measured. That's not morality. That's risk management dressed up as principle. The exile ended, essentially, because one producer was willing to test the assumption, and the assumption turned out to be soft. Not because anyone repented. There was no reinstatement and no apology, because there had been no ban, which is exactly the point. She lived another 25 years. She divorced Rossellini in 1957 and married Lars Schmidt in 1958. She worked constantly, on stage and on screen, in Europe and America. In 1974, she won her third Oscar for Murder on the Orient Express, and used part of her acceptance to say the award should have gone to Valentina Cortese, which, if you want a measure of the woman, is a person publicly reallocating the industry's highest honor at the moment of receiving it. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1974 and worked through it for the better part of a decade. Her last performance was as Golda Meir. She died in London on August 29, 1982, on her 67th birthday. And now, the twist, and it has two halves. The first half is the apology. On April 19, 1972, Senator Charles Percy of Illinois entered a statement into the congressional record saying that one of the world's loveliest, most gracious, and most talented women had been made the victim of bitter attack in that chamber 22 years earlier. He wrote that millions of Americans would wish to join him in expressing regret for the personal and professional persecution that had caused Ingrid Bergman to leave the country at the height of her career. She told the New York Times she had received a copy. Note what the apology is and what it cannot be. It is a correction to the congressional record, because the congressional record is the only place in this entire affair where the hostility was ever written down, and it was written down by a senator, not by Hollywood. The film business, which did the actual excluding for 7 years, has never apologized for anything, because it never admitted to doing anything, because it never wrote anything down. You cannot retract a phone call that was never made. That is the final elegance of an informal exclusion. It cannot be apologized for. There is no document to amend, except there is an archive of this affair, and it is entirely hers. The Ingrid Bergman collection sits at the Reed Cinema Archives at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, alongside the papers of Frank Capra and Elia Kazan, and filmmakers and biographers travel there to consult an extensive paper and photographic archive. In 2015, the director Stig Björkman made a documentary called Ingrid Bergman. In her own words, built out of her home movies, photographs, diary entries, and letters. With access to that collection, it uses the home movies she made throughout her life with her own camera, her diaries read aloud, her own baby pictures, and her original screen tests for Selznick, her own camera. Go back to Stockholm. Justus Bergman filmed his daughter constantly because he was a photographer and because she was what he had. Then he died and she was 13 and there were no more parents. And at some point she picked up a camera herself and began doing to her own life what her father had done to her childhood. And she did it for 50 years on 3 continents, through 2 marriages and 4 children and a 7-year exile. And she kept the film. She also kept the letters. She kept the diaries. She kept her first wedding dress with a note pinned to it in her own handwriting, explaining what it was, which is not the act of a sentimental woman. That is cataloging. That is a person labeling an item for someone who will find it later. She had been taught by the age of 13 that people vanish without warning and leave nothing behind, so she left everything behind, on purpose, indexed. And here is the detonation. Set the 2 archives side by side. The American film industry, across 7 years, generated one letter, Joseph Breen's private warning telling her she was finished. That is it. That is the sum total of the written record of Hollywood's position on Ingrid Bergman. One man writing privately, unofficially, to warn her about a punishment that no one would ever formally impose. And she left a complete life. 50 years of film shot with her own camera, decades of diaries, the correspondence, the photographs of all 4 children, the letter to Rossellini that started it, a job application in 4 languages written by a woman who could have had anything, kept by the woman who wrote it. The industry that destroyed 6 years of her career left almost no evidence that it had done so. The woman it destroyed them on left the most complete personal archive of any star of her generation. So when a historian sits down today to work out what actually happened between 1949 and 1956, whose account do they have to use? Hers. There is no other one. Hollywood declined to write anything down, and in declining, it forfeited the record to the only person in the affair who had been keeping one since she was a teenager. That is why the story we have is hers, not because she won an argument, because she was the only one taking notes. There is a counter-archive here too, and it's small, and it belongs to her children. Pia Lindstrom talked, on the record, as an adult with clear eyes. Isabella Rossellini has talked for 40 years. They are, between them, the only people who can describe what it was like to be on the other side of this woman's choices, and they have both done it publicly and without flattening her into either a saint or a monster. And that matters, because their mother had already been made into a saint once, professionally, by a publicity department, and it nearly killed her. So look at the camera again. A Swedish photographer in a Stockholm apartment in about 1918, filming a small girl who had just lost her mother, because filming things was what he did, and because she was what he had left. That footage exists. You can watch it. It is in the documentary, and it is the earliest surviving image of Ingrid Bergman, and she is too young to know she is being recorded. For 100 years, the story of Ingrid Bergman has been a story about being looked at, the most photographed face of the 1940s, the natural one, the unmanufactured one, marketed on the promise that what you saw was what she was. Then a scandal, and the same face on every front page, and a senator describing her as a powerful influence for evil to a chamber of men who had mostly never met her. But follow what she did with a camera. She turned it around. The girl who was filmed before she could speak spent 50 years filming back. Her children, her houses, her sets, her friends, the islands and the hotels, and the 7 years nobody in America would employ her. She was not documenting a career. She was manufacturing the one thing that had never been available to her, which is proof that the people in her life had been there. Hollywood got 7 years of her working life and left no record that it had taken them. The Senate got a sentence into the congressional record and had to take it back 22 years later. And Ingrid Bergman got the footage, the diaries, the letters, and the boxes. And the archive, not the exile, is the thing that ended up telling the story.